Brought to you by MuleSoft, provider of the industry-leading Anypoint platform for APIs.
Hi, I'm Laura Heritage. I'm the Director of API Strategy at SOA Software, and today we're going to go over the various API description languages and dig into which one is right for you. When I get to travel the world and talk to all sorts of enterprise customers and understand their needs, and one of the biggest questions that they have for me is which API description language should we use? So let's begin. So what is an API description language? Well, it should be, I look at 4 characteristics of an API description language. The first thing, it should be a blueprint for how you design your API, right? Uri gave a really good talk previously saying around API designs using Rammel, and it really should be a blueprint for how you implement your APIs in an enterprise. And as he said previously, when you're dealing with an enterprise, you're not dealing with 1 or 2 or 3 external APIs. You're dealing with hundreds of APIs in the enterprise. The next thing that the description language should be able to do is become that contract between your consumers. Okay, no matter if that consumer is inside your enterprise or outside your enterprise or to partners, it becomes a contract, a way to communicate with them. The third aspect of an API description language would be to capture the metadata about the API. And so this metadata about the API can then be used, in the Internet of Things and discoverability and all the good things that metadata is used for. So the API description language should have a good way to capture that metadata. And finally, the fourth characteristic of a good API description language is it should be human readable, right? You should be able to pick it up and pretty easily understand what that API is going to do. You shouldn't have to have a PhD to read the specification, like you did with WSDL, understanding that. Okay, so what about WSDL 2.0 and waddle? Well, for REST, they're not widely adopted. In fact, is anybody in here using WSDL 2.0? Try to go out on the internet and try to find a WSDL 2.0 example, like of describing a RESTful service, and you cannot do it. I mean, I tried searching every which way, and I got a couple, but it's just not used. I don't know really any of my enterprise customers using WSDL 2.0 at all. Waddle is used a little bit more, but again, it's typically machine generated, not human readable. Yeah, typically both of them are auto generated from code. You can't really use them as a blueprint, right? If you're trying to communicate what your API is going to do to someone who's non-techie, taking them a WSDL or a waddle specification and saying, what do you think of this? They'll go cross-eyed. Now, if you just take a WSDL, the WSDL 1.0, it contains most everything you need, but it's very quite brittle. So when I look at API description languages for an enterprises, typically we take WSDL 2.0 and waddle off the table. Now, one of the biggest things when I was talking with my customers and why they initially didn't adopt REST was because there was no good way to describe them, to govern the RESTful services. And what API description languages bring to an enterprise is a way to provide governance, to provide that lifecycle management that you need to be able to do. Like I said, if you're a startup company and you only have 1 to 10 APIs, you're like, oh, we don't need lifecycle and governance. But if you're an enterprise dealing with literally 100 or more APIs or services, this becomes incredibly important. The other reason why API description languages allowed enterprises to adopt RESTful services more, especially in the last couple of years, is because it makes them shareable. right? You can easily take a description language from a RESTful and share it. There were so many times prior to Swagger, prior to Rammel, that the enterprises said, well, we would use REST, but we don't have a way to describe it or share it amongst the people that we're trying to communicate with. And finally, the API description languages made it readable, okay? So the enterprises are now adopting RESTful APIs more and more because of this. And in fact, when back in 2012, I always asked my customers, I always did a poll, okay, what's the percentage? Are you using SOAP or are you using REST? Prior to 2012, I would say all new development of APIs were SOAP, okay? After 2012, after probably about March 2012, I mean, it was a short period of time, I would say it swung the other way, that 90% of the new services and new APIs that were being developed are now RESTful, and only a small portion are being developed as SOAP-based services. Okay, so what are the API description languages available? There's quite a lot. I mean, we had IO docs, we have JSON docs, we've got Swagger, Rammel, Waddle, which we already just kind of discontinued in the same way with WSDL. What we're going to look at today, though, the three that we're going to focus on is the Swagger, the Rammel, and the API Blueprint. Okay, these are the three most good contenders, and I'm going to bring those down because I really don't see API Blueprint in enterprise customers. And so I'm going to basically, while it's a good contender compared to the others, this is all I'm going to talk about, the API Blueprint. The two main contenders are Rammel and Swagger. Okay, so Rammel is a YAML-based language. Yes?
Could you just quickly say why you're not going to consider the hypermedia ones?
For this one, not a lot of the enterprises are into hypermedia yet. I haven't found very many customers that are using hypermedia yet, which is why I'm focusing on Rammel and Swagger.
But an enterprise would never lead the groundbreaking technology like web APIs anyway, right?
They would never lead.
Yeah, it wouldn't follow the enterprise examples. Enterprises are going to, fall behind what is, leading technology.
Right, and so this talk is focused on what, from an enterprise perspective, which API description language is best for you. So the two that we're going to talk about is Rammel, which is YAML based. It's available at GitHub. MuleSoft is sponsored by it. Its current version is 8.0, and there is a work group of which So Software is a part of. Its initial commit date, it's very young. It's just over a year old, and it is from a top-down design. Now, the other one that is probably the most adopted, probably because it's simply because it's been out the longest, is Swagger. Now, that is JSON-based. It just released 2.0, a week ago on September, or 2 weeks ago. September 8th, they released their 2.0. It's available on GitHub. Reverb is the sponsor of it. It's 2.0, but it's been available since July 2011, which is why it's mostly the most wide adopted API description language. Now, with the release of Swagger 2.0, a third party has built a top-down deployment tool for that, based on YAML as well. So you still have the Swagger specification, which is in JSON, but a third party has built a YAML-based tool that will allow you, similar to Rammel, describe your API and then translate it to the JSON specification. So Swagger is really a bottom-up. So you really are coding and documenting as you're coding. It's not from a top-down perspective, like Rammel and API Blueprint. Yes?
A little bit more to the difference between top-down and bottom-up, Swagger and Rammel.
So with Rammel, You start, were you in Yuri's presentation? It's just like that. You might not even have the API. You don't know what your API is going to build, and you start, before you go into any code whatsoever, before you decide that you're going to use Node.js, before you decide you're going to use RESTful web service, Java with RESTful web services, before you get to any implementation, you define what your API looks like. Okay, that's top down. From a Swagger perspective, you actually start coding. Right, so you might be coding in Node.js, or you might have already started to develop your Java, your RESTful service in Java, and then you run this tool, code gen tool, and then that'll generate your documentation after. So it's more of a bottom-up approach. You start coding right away, pretty much with that. Okay. So which one do you choose? It really depends. It depends on what you want to do. First, so I created a bunch of criteria of things that you think of what you would do. So one is I need the ability to design the API with technically limited API stakeholders. Okay, so these stakeholders might be API product managers or somebody that is kind of technically savvy, but they're not really technically savvy. If you threw them a WSDL or some Java code, they would be, slightly confused. But if you described it in an English type language of what that API is going to do, right, they would understand, right? Get users, get deliveries, and so forth. And so in this instance, from a top-down English standpoint, I would say Rammel is a very good option here. If this is what you need to do, if you need to share with kind of technically savvy but not super technically savvy people, okay, or technically limited people. Swagger, they do have that third-party tool, top-down tooling now that you might want to use, but I think Rammel at this point is a better approach. Okay. The next one, I want to describe and design an API with my technical team. Okay, so let's say you're a bunch of techies, right? You don't have to worry about non-techie people having to have a say in your APIs. What do you want to do? Well, both of them make a good option here. Okay, Swagger is good, obviously, because you can just go right to the code and you can, just start typing away and then generate your docs as you're going. And there's a couple of different options here that we'll talk about later, which is good. Rammel, though, also is a very good option here. Okay, and I'll get into this a little bit later. With Rammel, I think it's very good when you're doing top-down development. You can start very, very basic. Okay, but Rammel also introduces things like includes, like inheritance, like traits, that when you start using those, I find get a little bit more complicated. So it takes away from that simple user-readable standpoint. But what it gives you a standard. So if you're an enterprise dealing with 100 services and you want to make all of your services act and work in a similar function, right? Rammel is an excellent tool for that because you've got that inheritance, you've got that traits, and you can say, well, all of our APIs, if you have a collection, need to inherit from this collection type and need to have these different traits, and you can specify that out in a Rammel from a Rammel standpoint, whereas Swagger isn't to that point yet. In Swagger 2.0, they did introduce the notion of being able to import external schemas, where with the Swagger 1.2, they didn't have that. So new in Swagger 2.0, you can do some imports, but it still can't give you the robustness that Rammel can do as far as traits and collections and inheritance. Let's say I need to validate requests and response at runtime. Swagger does this very well with its Swagger Node Express and Swagger Play capabilities, right? Rammel has Opsbury that allows you, it's a component that you can put in, and the community is growing, you know, just like Uri said, you can go to GitHub for both of these communities, Swagger and Rammel, and find almost any tool that you need to use. So they're pretty similar there. Let's say I need to easily consume an API specification between 2 or more systems. I think both Swagger and Rammel will do this well. I would say Swagger, more systems right now today understands and can digest Swagger than can digest Rammel, but I think that's just a point in time statement. I need to document for audit and compliance reasons. Both can do that very well. I need an exceptional external API experience, developer experience. I mean, de facto today, pretty much everybody's been using the Swagger UI, right? I mean, you go to all the developer portals, it's just kind of like the de facto thing. I mean, we support it with SOA software, but I would contend that the Rammel has a very nice user interface as well that you can take and embed in your developer portal. And I actually, after playing around with it, really liked how the Rammel UI looked and feel. And you can, you know, if your developer portal's robust enough, you could be able to plug and play either one of those. So I would say they're tied, and I think even the Rammel one might be, for the experience, might be ahead. But again, the Swagger one, because it's been around a while, pretty much everybody's using the Swagger UI. Okay, I need to generate server-side code. Both of them can do that well, right? So if you did top-down on either of them, you can generate code from it. Though it's a little bit harder, like I said, to generate Swagger from a top-down perspective. Easier with Rammel. Generate client code. Swagger has a huge library to generate client code. Okay, so they've got, I mean, they've been around the longest, and it's easy, so their library is huge. Rammel is, I put a star there because I know there are some things going on there with generating client-side code that I don't know when MuleSoft or the Rammel group will announce those, but it'll come, it'll get there. Again, more and more people are generating it. I need to unit test against the specification. Both Swagger and Rammel, you can use it for unit testing, and they have integration with, you know, the SmartBear tools and so forth. All right. So the other aspect that I looked at is how do you pick a language that fits for you. It's really how your team works, okay? How does your team work? Are you going to have the discipline to do the top-down development, right, and go on from there? Or so, for example, do you design before you code? If you design before you code, I think Rammel is the right one for you. Do you generate documents after you code from your code? If that's the case, Swagger is good. And depending on what your language is, Swagger has more language options, right? Right now, depending on what your language is, you can embed Swagger in most of them and generate the code, generate the documents after you code. Rammel has RESTful web services to Rammel and vice versa, so you can go from Rammel to the specification, the RESTful services. Do you want to embed your docs into your server code? That's a Swagger thing, right? Really embed that. It's kind of fun. I played with it, and I'll go through that and show you what it is. But for an enterprise, I don't know if you want to embed your API description languages in your code, because it's going to stay around forever. Nothing at an enterprise. So if you talk to a bank, banks say nothing at a bank ever dies, right? So you're going to be supporting it for forever. So I don't know if you want to actually embed it in your server code. Again, it just depends on how you work and what your company is. Look at the community. Swagger, by far, has the largest community because it's been around since 2011. Rammel, though, is really growing. And when I talk to my enterprise customers and I ask, you got to remember, I'm from SOA Software, and we actually support both Swagger and Rammel. From an enterprise customer standpoint, they're leaning towards Rammel because of the more richness of the specification with the inheritance and traits and so forth. If you know, documentation from code, I was just talking about that. Swagger has a lot more. Eiffel, who here programmed in Eiffel? I thought I was the only one because that's the language I learned in. So I was super excited when I saw that Eiffel is, you can generate documents from Eiffel. Spec parsers available in Java and JavaScript. Rammel has a lot of different spec parsers, so that's where Rammel had a little bit more capability. API interfaces, they have both Java and Node.js. Client code, again, Swagger has several. Rammel, it's still developing, okay, but it's there. Editing tools, okay, well, Swagger top-down, up until this third-party submitted specification, really didn't have a nice editing tool to create a Swagger doc, and I don't like to have to sit there and type it up in JavaScript because it's a pain. Rammel has API Designer, Sublime plugin, and Atom. I've used the Sublime plugin, and I've used the API Designer. I kind of flip back and forth depending on if I'm flying and offline, or depending on my mood. I switch between the API Designer and the Sublime plugin. Okay, so when I was investigating all these API description languages for my enterprises, I thought, well, I want to start from scratch. I want to take an example and put them through and see how fast, how easy it was to use both the description languages. So my son came into my office, this was early September, and it was his birthday soon, right, a couple weeks, and he was always rattling off all these things that he wanted. And I'm like, you know what, that's what I'm gonna make. I'm gonna make a wish list application so that he can just go around on his iPhone or on his DS or whatever device he's playing with, and if he finds something, he can add it to it. So I'm like, okay, well, I need to create an API. I'm going to do it very simple. I'm going to have add users, add a wish, get all wishes in the system, get a wish for a particular user. I decided my platform, just to make it simple, I was going to use Node.js, Express, and a MongoDB. So that's what I was going to implement on. And I was going to run it with, I'm going to run it through top to bottom with Rammel, and then I was going to do it with Swagger and see which one was easier and what my experience was. Just to give you a background so you understand why some of the comments I make because of my history. I had a degree in computer science and mathematics. I was at IBM for 16 years, working with, 14 years, I mean, it kind of makes me feel bad. 14 years working with SOAP and REST and SOA and APIs. Over the years, I've been everything from a developer to an architect to a competitive technical sales to a product manager to an evangelist. I've always been on the bleeding edge of things. And I consider myself a Sunday developer. So when I have time on the weekends or when I'm flying, I tend to play with the code. And I spend most of my time working with customers. But I think the biggest thing here that influences me is the 16 years of enterprise experience and working with customers and being drilled into and understanding the importance of top-down. And because of the importance of top-down, I decided the easiest thing to do would be to use Rammel because that's just the way I think. And because I was starting from complete scratch and was just going to hack it out and I didn't even know what I was going to do, I thought, well, I'm going to design it. Rammel kudos to the Rammel team because they have very good documentation, very good tutorial. You can start with the 101 or 100 and move all the way down to the 200s where you get into traits. So you can start with the simple definitions that even non-techie people can understand, and then you can go down into working into how do you use traits and inheritance and things like that. So very, very easy to understand. The two editors, like I said, I used API Designer and the Sublime editor. With Rammel, because it has includes, you can have one-to-many files. So you can do everything in one file, or you can have several different files, your schemas and files and your collections and traits defined in a file and import those. I just left everything in one file. I did play with it, but in the end, I left everything in one file because my stuff was really easy. And I didn't put any security on it. It has a couple of different things to generate a UI in the documentation. You can run from Rammel to HTML, Rammel to HTML, PHP. Again, the UI, I thought it was really nice. I really liked the Rammel UI that was generated. My Rammel experience, great documentation, great samples. It's a great way to model your API. Because I did it top down, I found that when I was creating my code, I did go back to my specification many times to say, oh, what was I doing here? What I didn't do is I didn't generate my code from my specification. I actually just went and wrote the code there. This is a good way to enforce standards, design standards for your APIs in an enterprise. And I think that's one of the things, again, that have enterprises looking more towards a Rammel specification. Community tools, are easy to understand, install, to work with. I played with the API Designer, the Sublime plugin, the Rammel to HTML. They have a Swagger to Rammel, so you can take a Swagger doc and generate Rammel. And I believe there's the vice versa one. Now, again, the OpsFree to validate during runtime. So then after I built that, so it didn't take me long to do that. That was pretty slick. After that, I went to Swagger. The Swagger community is, I think, is a little more wild, wild west when trying to figure out some of the documentation and how to use it. But those are the two places to get started. There's 3 ways to create Swagger docs. The most common and traditional way is code gen. So basically, it converts the annotations in your code. So as you're coding up, you write your annotations, and then it'll generate the docs. That is by far the most common way to do it. The third one is manually. You can write the JSON by hand. That, depending on what your API is and how complex it is, that's a pain. So I didn't do that one. Because I'm kind of lazy like that. The one I played with, because it seemed the most fun, was automatically. So I used the Swagger Node Express and the Swagger Play, where you actually embed the Swagger documentation into your code as part of it, and it generates the specification right at as your code is running. Okay, so that's pretty cool, like I said. However, for an enterprise, I don't know if you want to embed your API description language in your code like that, but it was pretty cool. Here is the Swagger Node Express. Up on top, you create. So when you use Swagger Node Express, you've got your server file, your model.js, which describes all of your resources. You've got your routes, which defines the routes for accessing your data logic. Okay. So then what you do in your routes file, at the beginning, you have the spec, right? So I don't know if you can see this. Is it up there? So right up here, everything here is basically, you put in the Swagger stuff, right? Right in your method. And then down below is just like your action code. So you really mungle everything together. But it is quite fun when you actually see the results. The good thing about this is that your documentation and your code, your documentation is always up to date, okay? So you don't have to worry about things getting out of sync. So that is a benefit, and we'll get into that later. Swagger, so this is a Swagger 1.2 UI, we all know that. Swagger is composed, in 1.2 was composed of 2 files. You have your resource listings, which basically just lists all the APIs available that you have, and then the API description. So each one of those resources would then have an API description document, and that's all you had, 2 files. In 2.0, they got rid of the 2 separate files, and everything can be in 1 file. But they also created the ability to have includes, so you can externalize schemas and different aspects of the specification in 2.0, which is nice. Thoughts on Swagger? Most widely used today, working with Swagger, Node Express, it's a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun doing it. It's definitely not top-down. I actually went and used my Rammel specification to help me write my Swagger, my Swagger service. Con is you're really embedding it through your code, but in the other aspect of it, your documentation stays up to date. There's nice projects and examples. The Swagger UI is very useful to visualize. If you have complex APIs, Swagger probably isn't going to have the constructs that you need to model those. Okay, it's pretty basic. Writing Swagger is not fun. The new Swagger editor based on YAML is promising, but then again, you have to translate from that YAML document to the Swagger document, so you could, depending on if they keep those things in sync, you could run into issues there. Okay, so where do you want to document? Okay, document and design and generate interfaces and docs from the design. The good thing about this, it allows for the docs to change without disturbing production code. Okay, so if you've misspelled something or you've you just need to make some document changes, it allows you to do that. It allows for national language translation, and if back-end implementation changes but interfaces stay the same, you're okay. You don't have to redo the documentations. The cons about documentation and design is that the documentation can get out of sync with the code that's running in production. Okay? The next place is document in the code and generate documents from the code. Documentation is likely to stay in sync because you're actually documenting in your code. It's just part of the JXRS specification, right? You're kind of doing it already anyways. If there's issues with the documentation, you need to edit the production code to regenerate, depending on how much documentation you put in there. Embed the documentation in the server code and have the server dynamically serve up the docs. Benefit here, documentation is always in sync, okay? The bad news here is now you're tied to a particular API description language, and if there is user documentation errors, you're gonna have to change your code, right? So depending on what your risks are and what you do, that could be an issue. Okay. Thoughts on API description languages today? Well, all API description languages are starting to provide similar features and functions. I mean, you're going to see that with API Blueprint. API Blueprint has a lot of similar characteristics as Rammel. It's just not widely adopted and definitely not as robust as Rammel. Swagger, is also starting to move from more to a Rammel like specification as well, being able to do the top-down designs. It's, contributed by a third party, but you're going to see that merge. Neither of these specifications that we focused on today can document anything other than RESTful APIs, which when you have an enterprise that has probably today 500 SOAP-based services, you know, they're still going to have to maintain their WSDLs, right, for those base services, and now they're going to have to do this Rammel. So that's the only thing is you don't have one description language to cover both SOAP and REST. I guess WSDL does that, but again, that didn't meet a lot of our criteria of what an API description language should cover. Neither of these specifications provide for an extension. So for example, if we want to extend the specification to have criteria around setting SLAs or monitoring of these specifications. Now, that was a comment, because I wrote this presentation at the beginning of September, but Swagger came out with their specification in the middle of September. Swagger does now have the capability to provide extensions. Okay, so that's a nice thing from a Swagger point of view. Neither of the specifications handle national language translation in their documentation yet. And neither of the languages really are focusing on any of the system-to-system type integrations that interactions that we're going to be seeing a lot more with these APIs. Today, the focus on these API description languages really have been on the consumption side of the house, how to make it easier for people to consume, how to make it easier for providers to govern, describe the metadata. So we'll see a lot more coming with the IoT and system-to-system integrations and how that pertains to the use of these API description languages. With that, I want to, there's a couple references that I used. Ole Lensmar from SmartBear, he did one of the first comparisons between API description languages in February. So he's got another presentation. I took a little bit different look at the API description languages. And then also Dan Meyer there has a huge blog written up on the various API description languages as well that you can go and read. But thank you very much. I'll be out meandering around if you have any more questions. Thanks.
Brought to you by MuleSoft, provider of the industry-leading AnyPoint platform for APIs.